Kenward, thank you so much for joining us. I'm very excited to have the opportunity to talk with you today.
Well, I'm absolutely delighted to be here, Patricia, and any opportunity to talk about gut health and our emotions and trauma is a good one for me.
Wonderful, wonderful. I've been so excited to share with listeners about the freeze response and how that interacts with the gut function and also with our emotions from your perspective and your expertise. So I'm just so excited. Before we begin, I have a box here that I just got in the mail this morning from Amazon, and I'm just going to open it up here on the spot. I have something exciting to share with our listeners. Yes. So, for the first 10 of you
How lovely.
that comment on my website with a little bit of a question or a comment or whatever you take away from today's talk, you will get from me a free copy of Nikki's book, Overcoming Digestive Conditions, Chronic Digestive Conditions, Release the Visceral Layers of Post-Traumatic Gut Disorder. So excited. Stay tuned till the end of this talk, and I will give you the specifics on how to get your free copy.
Fabulous. How lovely.
Yeah. Okay, so Nikki, let's just dive right in. So one of the things that I talk quite frequently with my clients and listeners and readers about is the three branches of the involuntary nervous system, also known as the autonomic nervous system. And those three branches are the fight or flight, rest and digest, and freeze and fawn. I know that you also talk a lot about the nervous system of the gut in your book, and that's what it's all about. And I would love for you to just share a little bit for our listeners about your perspective on those three branches and how the gut ties into all of that.
Yeah, no, I'd love to. I think this is really interesting, and I think it's a story that keeps unfolding as we understand more. You know, it wasn't so long ago that we thought we just had two branches, fight and flight, rest and digest. And then Stephen Porges came along and polyvagal, and it evolved. And we realized there was the sympathetic fight and flight. There was the dorsal vagal, the very old primitive branch of the vagus nerve, mostly under the diaphragm in the digestive system. And then there's the ventral vagal branch, which is more about social attachment and connection, and is found mostly superior to the respiratory diaphragm. So what we're using now to engage with each other with our tones of voice, our eyes, face, gestures, my hands. I know I'd be speechless without my hands. And so then we had those three, and then everything expanded more to include the freeze and fawn, which I guess is more the dorsal part of the vagus nerve in the gut. So the interesting thing is, I think, with the gut and why it's so complicated and hard to kind of get hold of is that the enteric nervous system, which innervates the whole of our gut, our small, large intestine, stomach, most of the esophagus, that has been called now our second brain. And it is not only strongly connected to the dorsal vagal and the ventral vagal, eventually part of our system and fight and flight, but it also does its own thinking and its own processing. So that makes it harder to get a handle on what's going on, because we know there are complete nerve circuitries in the enteric nervous system, so it can make decisions without referring to any part of the vagus nerve or the brain. So the enteric nervous system, often called the second brain in the gut, has complete circuitries, neural circuitries in it. That means it can, if it wants to, make its own decisions without referring to the vagus nerve or the brain in the head.
It's just such a huge thing, I think. And so tell us more about the significance of that.
So I think the significance of that is that, number one, we have another branch of the autonomic nervous system, really. We have sympathetic, ventral vagal, dorsal vagal, and the enteric system, which is influenced and influences all the other three. And I think the other thing is that we know that the gut sends more messages to the brain and the head on the vagus nerve than come down the other way. Plus, it does a lot of work on its own. So I think what we know now is that our understanding to date has been small of this nervous system. And I think there is so much more to come. We don't fully understand the connection between the enteric system and the vagus nerve and the brain and the head. It's new, it's opening up. And I think what I find in my clinical practice and what I read more and more is that our nervous system isn't straightforward. Obvious comment that the ability to go from one state to the other fluidly and to adapt according to the situation we're in is a very good marker of health. But of course, the enteric system and its state is just like the other autonomic states, and we can get into very unhelpful default states and then not be able to get so easily into one of the other states. And they blend and they move, and I think it's all to come, our understanding.
For our listeners, can you say a bit more about the significance of the enteric nervous system or the gut being able to make its own decisions, and what kind of a default state that might put us in that would be counterproductive for us?
There can be many examples of this. There's one really interesting, simple example. We have some wonderful neural cells in the enteric system called IPANs, and I remember that by thinking of them as pots and pans. Anyway, they're actually in the small intestine, and they're primary afferent neurals. They're quite large oval neurons. Now, these are interesting because if we are, for example, very, very stressed for more than just a moment, and maybe we've had like a really difficult week at work, we go home and somebody has made us a lovely, nourishing chicken soup, for example. The whole family eats it, and everybody's thinking, oh, that was so good. But my IPANs, if I've had a bad week, that soup will come down and they'll say, this is toxic, this is poison, and I will be up all night, either throwing up or diarrhea or both. Not because there was anything wrong with the soup, but because my gut, my nervous system has decided, because these particular nerves, obviously in connection with many other things, but they have decided that they are not accepting anything and that it's poison.
And that's just because you've had an emotional week, something bad has happened.
Yeah. And so they just make that decision. And, there are so many other examples, really, of unhelpful defaults. So another example, if you'd like one, is say you have a very traumatic event, you dissociate from that, you're overwhelmed, you go beyond fight and flight into the freeze response, maybe further into the flop, into the kind of completely playing dead response. But anyway, so you're in that kind of response. And if you're in that response in the gut frequently, then it will tend to keep that as its default. And this I've seen a lot, and I did in myself, which is in my book, but also in people that have come to me in my clinical practice. And this is very interesting because this is what I think it can lead to constipation, not always, but I think the most important thing about that is that these memories, that traumatic experience gets really buried deep when it goes into that freeze response, into that really deep dorsal vagal response and the enteric response on its own. So both the dorsal vagal will be taking us into freeze and the enteric nervous system will get into that freeze as well. And then it's very hard to get to it. I'm sorry, that didn't sound very clear, but I think that's what happens, and that's what makes it very hard to reach those parts of our emotional history.
And so for a person who has experienced the freeze and fawn, or like you said, flop, they would have maybe not only chronic digestive conditions, but also how would that impact their ongoing autonomic regulation or involuntary nervous system regulation?
Well, I mean, if they're in freeze and dissociated in the gut, that's going to impact the whole of their autonomic nervous system as well.
Mm-hmm.
It would be very unlikely that it was only in the gut,
Mm-hmm.
only in the dorsal. It's going to mean it's maybe harder for them to get into the ventral vagal attachment situation because they're more often in the dorsal or the freeze situation. So
Mm-hmm.
that becomes difficult relationship connection.
So these types of situations that we have that caused us to go initially into this freeze or fawn or flop state, then they have can have prolonged impacts on a person twofold, both in their emotional aspect in the way that they are able to regulate their nervous system and also in their digestive function.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think the more I read about it and talk about it and look at the research, the more you realize that you can't separate these things out. You know, an example of not being able to separate it is, I'm sure you know about the ACE study, Adverse Childhood Experience study, which anybody can Google and find out. And one of the big things this found was that early year experience, if it's challenging and difficult or traumatic, will have a negative impact on that child's gut microbiota. And that's going to have a lifelong impact. And we know that the gut bacteria, the microbiota, is involved in every single action within the enteric nervous system. Whatever happens with the enteric neurons, enteric glial cells, there will be gut bacteria involved in that. These conversations are constant, moment by moment. And so the unhelpful default is going to be buried deep in the, even if they've worked through the trauma in many ways, there will be this physiological issue state that's left.
When you say microbiota and gut bacteria, for our listeners, if those terms aren't familiar, you're talking about the good bacteria, the probiotics that normally live in our gut, right?
Yeah, that's right. And we have quite a few different ones. We have the commensal ones, which are the ones that we ideally want to have a nice balance of all of those. So yeah, all the good bacteria and it includes some fungi, some virus, all of those things. If we have the right amount of the right ones, then that's great. And it needs to be really diverse for us to be healthy, mentally, emotionally, and physically. And so even leaving, diet to one side, the impact of our life experience is huge on this, and therefore on all the cells and the nerves in the gut.
So diet, it turns out, can have actually a huge impact on digestive function, especially for people who have had trauma in childhood.
Absolutely. So, I'm not a nutritional therapist. I have a very good one that I see fairly regularly, and it's extremely important. And I think if you've had that kind of a start in life, or, something else happens along the life journey that impacts your gut, it's so important to have the right diet and possibly supplementation to support and to get the best you can in terms of gut function. However, and so that's super important, and I do it for myself and send my clients to do it. But if you don't look at the physical and physiological impact of those experiences on your gut, you're wasting your money on the nutrition. I think that's the big message for me is, until you do your emotional work, until you get the good body work on your gut to get rid of those tension patterns, all of that to help improve the default setting, get everything working better, and then you get a good diet as well, and then you're going to be in a much better place. But if you get a really good diet with a good nutritionist and you haven't done your emotional work and you've still got all those issues with the cells, the gut bacteria, the nervous system in the gut, the enteric system, it's not really going to help.
Some of my clients and listeners are going to be, this is going to be preaching to the choir because they hear it from me regularly in my practice. But for those who are not familiar, and I know this is a broad question, but can you say just a little bit to prospective clients about what does it even mean to address the underlying emotional concerns, to do body work to help improve these strain patterns in the gut?
Yeah, because it's like it's one thing knowing it, but it's a whole other thing to know where to start, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think there are, when I say good body work, ideally it would be an Upledger therapist who's done my gut class who could, but they're not everywhere yet. But any good cranial therapist should be able to help you release some of those tension patterns in the gut, and maybe use the emotional and dialoguing techniques to help explore any emotional history that comes up. Our history is written in our body, and it's written very deeply in the enteric system.
Yes.
Which is what I've experienced myself and why I wrote the book. So, yes, good body work, good nutrition, learn how to breathe well. Sounds really simple, but most people don't.
It's not that simple.
Yeah, no, I know.
Or
It
perhaps
sounds
simple,
like,
but not easy.
yeah, exactly. And there's some really good recent research which shows that if we don't breathe in a helpful way because of probably an emotional event in the past, that the diaphragm dysfunction will have a direct impact on the health of the small and large intestine. So
Isn't that
breathing well.
interesting?
Yes, it's absolutely, there's a huge connection there. So
I love
learning to
knowing
breathe
that.
well is great.
Yeah. So, as a practitioner, I'm going to diverge for just a moment. Anything you want to expand on for that, as far as treatment of the diaphragm and the gut for clients that have maybe a history of shallow breathing or so forth?
Yes, sure. So I think one of the ways we protect ourselves when we're overwhelmed by some event or experience we're having is to restrict our breathing. We do it quite unconsciously, and we do it because it helps us not feel some of those intense emotional things that we're feeling. So, but when we do that, our breathing is very much a habitual thing. It can stay like that even when that moment or that stress may have passed long ago. So, there are many ways of addressing this, from as simple as putting your hands on the lower part of your ribs and just imagining you're breathing into the hands and all the way around the front, side, and back of the body. So breathing is a really 360-degree experience. We breathe into the front, the sides, and the back of the body. We do it consciously, and sometimes just something really simple like, taking a moment and consciously saying, I'm breathing in, I'm breathing out, with your hands on the lower parts of the ribs. I'm breathing in, I'm breathing out. It's very simple, but helps us focus on our breath. And the more we can, or we might go to a Tai Chi or a yoga class or a breath coach, or there are many ways. There's a fantastic book, which I'm sure you've read, called Breath or Breathe by Breath, James Nestor. And, that's a great book to read as well. But yeah, and then if we get that expansion and that proper functioning with the inhale and exhale, the diaphragm, that will make a big difference on the space and the relaxation of the intestines, circulation to them, everything.
Wonderful. Thank
Yeah.
you so much for sharing in depth a little bit more about that, not just for clients, maybe, but also practitioners who may be listening. You've mentioned a couple of times, and I know you talk a lot about it in your book, Overcoming Chronic Digestive Conditions. But if you would you mind sharing just a bit of your personal story about how you came to know so much about the underlying emotional conditions that can lead to gut dysfunction and why this became your area of expertise?
Absolutely, Patricia. And of course, it was no accident, was it, that I came to start talking about this? So I think the pivotal moment was about, oh gosh, 15, maybe even 20 years ago now. I don't know. Time goes so quickly. When I had a scuba diving accident, 60 feet under the surface in a cold Irish sea.
Mm.
And I nearly drowned. I was a few
Hmm.
seconds off dying, I think was what people felt at the time.
Mm.
So it was extremely traumatic. And I went, right through the fight, flight, freeze, block, right into the major opiate hit that you get just before, and the feeling of peace just before you die. So I've
Wow.
experienced that whole range personally. I hope I never have to do that again. I think that's
Yes.
and so anyway, I had, as you can imagine, a lot of therapy, counseling, CST, acupuncture, just trying to cardiologist because I had heart arrhythmias. There was all kinds of stuff going on.
Hmm.
And the one thing that I couldn't seem to completely improve was my gut function.
Uh-huh.
So, I went from right at the beginning, I would wake up in the night with palpitations and then have diarrhea and feel nauseous. And that would be a regular thing for months, years probably. And it got much better with everything. But what I realized was that my gut was just really severely impacted by this.
Hmm.
And although I was diagnosed with PTSD, of course, that is a diagnosis which was created by psychologists and psychiatrists.
Hmm.
So they don't really think about the gut. And so when you look at the list of symptoms or how you might diagnose, it doesn't figure in that. And
Hmm. They're
yet,
thinking more of cognitive or of
yeah,
emotional,
you know,
psychiatric.
yeah,
Uh-huh.
exactly. So, but I realized in myself, and then increasingly, once that penny had dropped,
Hmm.
in a lot of the people that I knew and came to me, that I was really had something which I call post-traumatic gut. And
Uh-huh.
the other big thing that happened was this experience, plus I was doing a lot of work with military veterans with the Institute as well at
Hmm.
that time.
The Upledger Institute. Uh-huh.
With the absolutely, yes. In every single case, including my own, there was a history of childhood trauma which predisposed the microbiome and the gut and the enteric system to respond in that way to that secondary big event.
Wow.
The big learning for me in myself and with the military veterans at the Upledger Institute intensive programs I was working on was to realize that my gut was long-term impacted by the trauma, but that what happened in myself and the veterans was preceded always in every case by childhood trauma, which had already, back to the ACE study, created an unhelpful microbiota and probably unhelpful default in the enteric system. So we were set up, the microbiota was set up to respond in that way to
Uh-huh.
a big event. And in fact, there's some recent research, and I have no idea where I read it, so I can't tell you this moment, which
Okay.
actually says that if you study somebody's gut bacteria, you can tell whether or not they're going to get PTSD if they have a big trauma.
Just incredible.
Yeah.
Mm. Well, as you know, I benefited greatly from taking your course. And before I took your course as a craniosacral practitioner, I read your book and came to self-diagnose with my own condition of post-traumatic gut. And I'll just share briefly that in my craniosacral practice here in Charleston, West Virginia, in the US, I treat a lot of people who have a history of childhood trauma. I see some people who are participants of a non-pharmacological pain management program for people in opioid addiction recovery, and lots of people who have just a lot of long-lasting trauma impacts that started in childhood but then spiraled in adulthood. And that was the case for me as well. I had a case of growing up with PTSD from childhood trauma and attachment trauma. And then I'm getting to a question here, actually, because I'd love for you to expand a little bit more on what you mean by the opioid hit that you got, because it mirrors something that I'm still learning about in my own progression from childhood trauma to recovery of trauma in adulthood. I had a car accident where I flipped over a cliff and lost consciousness, and then had to climb the cliff to get myself to safety. And so I was in that adrenaline state of survival mode. And that ties into everything that we're talking about with the gut, because of all of the different things that I've worked on to recover from childhood trauma, whether you call it attachment trauma, developmental complex, whatever kind of, we haven't set on a particular term for it yet, but the gut function has certainly been sleep and gut. Which one ties for the hardest for me to have really gotten to the other side of? I would have to say that my gut function is getting there, but still has room for improvement. So anyway, back to my question. Would you expand just a little bit on that transition that you mentioned between fight or flight and freeze and fawn and into the opiate
Absolutely.
blast?
Absolutely. So as you can imagine, so as we descended on the dive, I was already feeling a bit fight and flight because the water was cold. I hadn't dived for a while. I didn't feel very confident. Actually, it was a dive beyond my skills, but I was encouraged wrongly to do it, and I did it anyway. But so I was feeling a bit fight and flight, and then my mouth kept filling up through the regulator with seawater, and I couldn't get rid of it. So in that phase of the accident, I was absolutely panicking, fight and flight. I couldn't flight anywhere. I couldn't fight, but I was kind of fighting with the water and trying to get rid of it, because I was obviously holding my breath. And then when I just couldn't do this, and the regulator, I just let it stay out of my mouth because I couldn't breathe, I was in a lot of pain, physical pain, and my larynx cramped completely. It closed up. So then I started to suffocate. But it's good that it did. It was laryngospasm, that's the word. Because if it hadn't, the water would have gone into my lungs and it would have been curtains, definitely. But as it was, it stopped the water.
So it was a last-ditch effort survival mechanism.
Yeah. And so at that point, I was in freeze, and all I remember was hearing the squeak of my system trying to breathe. There was just this going on. But then and all these things seemed to go on forever. And of course, they didn't go on forever, but time felt stretched. And then all of a sudden, and it was literally sudden, from the pain and the suffocating, I came into suddenly a calm place. And I couldn't feel any physical pain anymore. I wasn't aware of anything in my body, interestingly, now I think about it. And all I can remember thinking at that point is, I don't want to go because of my children. But it was that calm, still, pain-free. I think I doubt whether I was really in my body at all at that point.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And it was like this huge opiate hit.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So there was a peace, but
Again,
also
a survival
challenge
mechanism to protect you from the mortal
from the
fear.
final bit.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
protecting me from the mortal fear and from the actual moment of death
Mm-hmm.
to make it
Mm-hmm.
more comfortable, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So fortunately for me at that point, the dive master who had not done their job well, as you can imagine, noticed that one of her party was drowning, literally, and came and grabbed me and took me up to the surface. But of course, I couldn't breathe, so my lungs were damaged because they couldn't expand, and my heart was damaged, but also my mind.
Uh-huh.
But the other interesting thing when you asked me to expand on that progress through those states is that, in fact, from quite a few years before, I was absolutely addicted to opiates.
Uh-huh.
Which is really, and I've never put those two things together.
Interesting that would come out of this conversation.
Yeah. So that was something I used to calm myself, and it slowed down my gut, which was helpful for me. And then, so it was that same feeling, only more so.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing.
No, you're welcome.
I will just share briefly, since that's what we're doing, I suppose, that I too have a history of abuse of opioids and know the experience of the obliteration of the present moment that is possible with drugs like opioids to allow us to be free of physical and emotional pain.
Exactly that.
I also want to just mention for our listeners to notice the calm. First of all, maybe notice in yourselves if you're experiencing any reactivity to Nikki telling her story, this near-death experience, because it can be quite emotional to hear someone tell. Yeah. But also notice the emotional calm that I'm observing in Nikki as she's telling this story. And then, Nikki, I wonder if you would mind to share just a little bit about what's transpired since getting up on deck after this very near-death experience of drowning and being able to tell the story calmly today.
As I think I said, a lot of talking and body work, and I took up yoga in order to regulate my heart rhythm again. Took 3 years. I got rid of all my arrhythmias. So it was a long process, and it was a gradual one. People talk and use these words of post-traumatic stress, and then going from being a victim to being a survivor to being a thriver. And I'm a huge believer in post-traumatic growth. And I think that's the thing, is that you process and integrate the experience as you can. So it loses its so much power over you, in the sense that I can talk about it calmly now. There's a little kind of, but mostly it's okay, and I have no objection to it. But I think those experiences do give us an opportunity for great growth and learning. And interestingly, of course, and I talk about this, as you know, in my book and course, if we think about Eastern beliefs, they refer to the lower dantian, to the gut, the lower part of the abdomen, as being the center of emotional and spiritual growth. So, I'd like to have got it a different way. But anyway,
you and me both.
Yeah, maybe more comfortable. But yeah, so it's been a huge, when you think about it, everything that's gone after that, from writing the class to my practice to the book to my work now in theatre as a director as well, which is about mental health and non-judgment of anybody who's had a lot of trauma and challenge.
I could definitely talk to you all day. I'll narrow it down to 2 and maybe 3 more questions for you.
Okay.
Well, first of all, I can't help but ask you just to share. You mentioned post-traumatic growth, and I certainly seem to observe that in you in the years that I've known you and watching what little I have seen on social media. Um, but I know that Bessel van der Kolk, for one, is a huge proponent of community theater and trauma healing. You are a previous professional dancer, now with your master's in circus directing. So
Yes.
what that is just so thrilling. And so tell me just something about that and what brings you to this point in your life at this age.
Well, because I was in theatre before and because I realised how important that is for our growth and how healing happens in community, and the arts help us process and express things that are important to the human condition, which is something I think we get when we go and watch a really wonderful dance or piece of theatre, is things can resonate. We don't feel so alone. We understand things. Maybe we get a new insight, all of those things. And I'd wanted for a few years to get some more creativity back into my life.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd looked and I wanted to do a master's, but I didn't want to do one in pure dance because I had spent a lot of years in dance.
Mm-hmm.
But I loved circus and physical theatre because it's a little bit bonkers, because a lot of the people in it are neurodivergent and a little bit unique, which I
Mm-hmm.
love.
Mm-hmm.
And I always feel completely at home amongst them
I love that.
and really accepted and included and never judged. And so that was a lovely experience for me because I dipped my toe into circus in my local community.
Mm-hmm.
So when I saw during COVID, when I was doing less, I saw there was a master's in directing circus and physical theatre. I just jumped at it.
I love it.
And now interestingly, I didn't expect to, but I am using it to tell the stories that are not often told.
Ah, I love that. Thank you so much for sharing. I just think it's so exciting that that's what you're doing with your life.
Yeah, I love
It,
it
it
too.
seems to me to be a beautiful representation of post-traumatic growth.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. I guess even though I really want to, I'm going to skip right over asking you about yoga and Ashtanga and your practice because
Yeah.
I want to get back to talking about your book a little bit. I know that in your book, there are some exercises that help readers to begin to address whatever gut issues and emotional issues are interconnected in their lives. And so would you mind sharing just a bit about how they might benefit from those exercises?
Absolutely. So they're very simple and they're mostly about sitting in a peaceful place, having your hands on your gut, focusing on your breath, then taking that focus into the tissues of the gut, noticing what you feel with your hands and anything that comes up. That's the very simple explanation of a longer description in the book. But I think one of the key things about that, which I have found with people doing it, is that it's quite hard and it was for me at first, to put your hands on yourself with compassion and care and non-judgment. So,
That
I
last one there,
feel this.
non-judgment.
Yeah, because, it's like, oh, my gut's playing up again. For goodness sake, I've eaten kefir for the last week. Why are you hurting? But when things go on and on and on, we can be I was certainly very frustrated. It's disheartening, it's debilitating and uncomfortable. And it was I kind of really had to make friends with my gut again. And some people it's taken, that I've worked with quite a long time. They've really so disliked their gut, they don't even want to put their hands on. So I think that's a key part of it.
Uh-huh. And what's your suggestion for people that are really struggling with being able to just touch themselves and connect into their gut with self-compassion?
Well, that's a good question. I guess it's patience,
Uh-huh.
and hopefully, if you read the book and you have a bit more insight into why things are the way they are,
Mm-hmm.
maybe that will help you then to realize that you need to get on side with this
Mm-hmm.
rather than fight it, and that fighting it is not going to help.
Yes.
And even if other people around you have been, which I've experienced, and I wouldn't mind betting you have as well, have been judgmental. I've had people in the past say, "Aren't you over that yet?" Talking about PTSD. "Aren't you over that yet?" And all these kind of really horrible things.
Uh-huh.
So then you feel ashamed, and you think, well, I ought to be, and why is my gut not? Is all that, which
Uh-huh.
is very real and very difficult.
Uh-huh.
So I think having an insight, understanding it, having very clear boundaries about who you share all this stuff with, so you're not so open to those kind of disempowering and horrible comments, which really can knock you off your feet for a while.
Yes.
And getting on side and connecting with your own gut, because this, is such a valuable place where you can do some healing.
I would agree. I often say to my clients, if you're not working with your body, you're working against yourself.
Yes. Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
great way of saying it.
Yeah.
I'm going to
So,
steal that.
okay. So for our listeners, here is your chance to get your free copy of Overcoming Chronic Digestive Conditions by Nikki Kenward. And so the way to do that is to visit bodysmarts.com/gallery. And then you'll just click on the place where it has the picture of the book, and it'll give you an opportunity to send a quick message and give us any kind of feedback or response that you'd like to give us about how this talk impacted you. And Nikki, if people have questions and would like to reach out to you, is there some way that they could do that?
Absolutely. So I believe they can contact me on my website, nikkikenward.com. But also I'm very happy to give them my Cranio email if they have questions. So that is Nikki, Nikki, .cranio, CRANIO, @gmail.com.
Thank you. Thank you again so much for taking time out of your busy life to talk with me and our listeners, to share some wisdom about the gut and the way that it impacts our emotional status and vice versa. I just so much appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you, Patricia. It's been an absolute delight to talk to you. And I just want to get the message out so people can begin to feel better.